Chosen ones, there are whispers that some words never fade, even when their speaker has long turned to dust. Manly P. Hall's final lecture was thought to be just another closing note in his vast archive of mystical thought, until the day the doors to that forgotten hall were opened again. The air was thick, almost metallic, as if the very atmosphere remembered what had been said. Dust motes hung suspended like tiny, listening spirits. The lectern still bore the faint grooves from the weight of his hands, carved into the wood over years of steady teaching. A leather-bound notebook rested there, pages yellowed and edges curled. No one knew who placed it back in that spot. Some say it had been there since the day he spoke his last words. Others insist it arrived only recently, carried by hands that moved unseen through the corridors. The first page wasn't written in ink, but in a faint, glowing script that seemed to fade and return, like breathing. It didn't read like philosophy. It didn't read like allegory. It was a map, though not of land or sea. This was a cartography of consciousness, a chart of where thought could bend reality if one knew the way. Behind the podium, the wall was not as it seemed, a hairline crack traced upward like a lightning scar, and when the light hit it just right, symbols emerged, ancient, not from any single culture, yet familiar in a way that stirred the deepest chambers of memory. The archivists who entered that day claimed to feel something pressing gently against their temples, as though urging them to remember. One swore he heard Hall's voice, not echoing through the air, but resonating from within his own thoughts. The final truth is never spoken. It is awakened. And then there was the sound. Faint at first, like the rustling of robes, growing into the steady rhythm of footsteps approaching, though the doorway remained empty. Something, or someone, was coming closer, unseen yet undeniable. That's when the lights flickered, and the notebook turned a page by itself. The script glowed brighter, spilling faint beams of gold into the room. The archivist leaned in to read the words, but before he could speak them aloud, the air shifted, cold, deliberate, and the sound of a key turning in a lock echoed through the empty hall. They said the podium had been untouched for decades, but the wood bore signs of recent movement, a subtle shift in its base, as though something heavy had been dragged from within. The janitor who first noticed it had been working the night shift, when the moonlight sliced across the floor, catching a small brass hinge beneath the carved edge. He had never seen it before, and when he knelt to inspect it, his fingernails brushed against something wedged deep inside. It was a letter sealed with wax so dark it almost drank the light. The seal bore a symbol no historian could easily place, part alchemical sigil, part celestial map, and something older than both. The paper crackled like dry leaves as he held it up to the dim lamp, its surface covered in an intricate hand, the kind of script that suggested it had been written by someone who understood the weight of every stroke. The envelope smelled faintly of sandalwood and iron. There was no name on the outside, only a single phrase pressed deep into the wax, "Not yet." The janitor did not open it that night. Instead, he placed it back, but the image of that seal gnawed at him. He returned the following evening armed with gloves and a quiet resolve. When the seal broke, the wax fractured into perfect halves, as though it had been waiting to release what was inside. The letter was not long, but it was dense. Each sentence pulling him deeper into a current of thought that felt both ancient and immediate. It spoke of a gathering, a convergence of minds drawn not by summons but by recognition. It referenced a hall without walls, a place both real and symbolic, where truth would be measured in silence rather than speech. Certain words seemed to hum on the page, vibrating faintly as if written with a pen that carried more than ink. He felt as though reading too quickly would cause something to slip past him. Unseen and ungraspable, the handwriting shifted, midway through becoming sharper, more deliberate, like the author knew they were nearing the heart of their message. The last line was underlined 3 times. It did not end with a period, only an unfinished curve trailing off into the margin. A thought cut short. The janitor stared at it, feeling certain that the missing part was not forgotten, but withheld. And in the heavy stillness of that hall, he thought he heard the faint scrape of a chair being drawn back from somewhere behind him. The archivist who came after the janitor's discovery was not searching for scripture. Yet, the folded parchment he found beneath the podium's false bottom carried the cadence of an ancient psalm. The ink was faint, but its rhythm was unmistakable. A sequence of lines that seemed older than any printed Bible. It spoke of a shepherd who would walk into the valley unafraid, not because the valley lacked danger, but because the light he carried was not his own. The words felt eerily familiar, though they were written in a hybrid tongue, part Hebrew, part something older and unrecorded. When he read them aloud under his breath, the sound seemed to hang in the air, too long, lingering like incense. The timbre of his voice shifted mid-recitation, softer, deeper, almost as though another spoke through him for a moment. He remembered the way his grandmother once whispered about a hidden line in the scriptures, one never printed in modern translations. She claimed it was a verse the Nazarene himself had spoken in the quiet hours between miracles, a promise not to the crowd, but to the solitary soul who stood on the threshold of surrender. As the archivist traced his finger over the faded letters, he felt certain this was it. There was a moment when the afternoon light pierced the high-stained glass and struck the parchment just so. The words glimmered gold, then silver, before settling into a deep crimson glow. And in that flicker, he thought he saw the faint outline of a cross, not drawn but formed by the negative space of the letters themselves. The air shifted like a curtain pulled back, and somewhere far off, a bell rang, not with urgency, but with a deliberate, measured tone. The archivist folded the psalm again, careful not to crease the fragile edges, and placed it against his chest. The warmth that bloomed there was not from the sun. It pulsed like a heartbeat, steady, unwavering. He tried to catalog the text, but every attempt to write it down resulted in missing phrases, entire lines that refused to be copied, as if the psalm itself chose when and to whom it would reveal its fullness. The archivist stood still for a long while, listening to the silence, until from somewhere beyond the hall, a low, melodic hum began to weave its way toward him, growing clearer with each passing breath. The notebook found near the podium was already an oddity, but it was the margin notes that drew the most attention. They were not simple annotations, but strings of symbols, small enough to be mistaken for flecks of dust unless viewed under magnification. The ink was darker than the main text and shimmered faintly under candlelight, as if resisting the flatness of the page. A linguist brought in to study them quickly realized the markings followed no known alphabet, yet they held the cadence of language. Each cluster seemed to fold into the next, forming a rhythm like steps in a complex dance. He noticed that certain shapes repeated at precise intervals, aligning with specific phrases in the main body of the text. This was no random scribbling. It was a cipher layered into the writing itself. He began transcribing the symbols into a separate notebook, careful to keep the spacing exact. When he matched the sequences against classical codes, nothing fit. But when he overlaid the patterns with an ancient star chart, something shifted. The symbols aligned perfectly with constellations, known for guiding travelers across oceans in ages before maps. The message began to emerge, not as sentences, but as coordinates and instructions. It became clear the cipher described a journey, not along roads, but across a map of ideas, a series of thresholds the mind had to pass through. Each set of coordinates corresponded to a specific concept in the lecture, as though the margin notes were a secret commentary, guiding the reader through a hidden layer of meaning. The linguist felt as though the author had been speaking to someone who would arrive far in the future, armed with the patience to see what others ignored. Late one night, he placed the notebook on his desk and traced one of the larger symbols with his fingertip. The room's shadows deepened, though the lamp did not dim, and the sound of wind rose from nowhere, carrying with it the faint murmur of voices. He leaned closer and for an instant thought he heard his own name spoken in a tone that was neither questioning nor commanding, but expectant. The wind stilled abruptly, leaving behind an unnatural quiet. In that silence, a single new symbol appeared on the margin in fresh ink, darker than the rest, as if someone had just written it, though no one else was in the room. The cipher's hidden coordinates led to a thin slip of parchment, wedged inside the final pages of a separate leather-bound volume, its edges brittle with age. The archivist who discovered it did not at first recognize the words, but as his eyes traced the lines, he realized he was reading a verse unlike any recorded in official scripture. It spoke not in the voice of a prophet or king, but in the quiet certainty of one who knew the end from the beginning. The verse spoke of a light that would not rise from the east or set in the west, but would appear where shadow had claimed dominion and remain unmoved. There was a peculiar quality to the phrasing. It was simple, yet carried the weight of something absolute. It mirrored the way the Nazarene once spoke in parables, each sentence layered with meaning meant to pierce deeper than the surface. The archivist found himself reading it aloud, and with each repetition, the words seemed to grow warmer until they felt almost alive on his tongue. In the dim reading room, the lamp above him flickered 3 times before holding steady. The light did not feel artificial anymore. It seemed to come from somewhere else entirely, touching the parchment in a way that made the faded letters stand sharp and clear. For an instant, he thought he saw the faint imprint of a hand just above the text, as though someone unseen rested their palm there, guarding it from decay. The verse hinted at a moment when the watchers would mistake the dawn for dusk, when those who measured time by the turning of the sun would find themselves unprepared. It spoke of a gathering of voices that would not shout but whisper, and yet their whisper would be enough to shake the pillars of empires. The words ended, not with a promise of triumph, but with an invitation for the reader to step into the light when it came, even if doing so meant leaving behind everything they had known. He sat back, his pulse steady but heavy, and glanced toward the far side of the room where the shadows had begun to stretch unnaturally long. Somewhere beyond the wall, a faint knock sounded 3 times evenly spaced, and then the light in the room dimmed as if something had passed between it and its source. The lecture hall had been closed for years, yet the caretaker swore he often saw a lone figure seated halfway up the tiered rows, always in the same seat and always leaning forward as if listening. The first time he approached the figure, he found nothing but an empty chair, still warm to the touch with the faint scent of parchment and candle smoke lingering in the air. No one believed him at first, but others began reporting the same encounter, a presence that never moved, except to shift slightly, as though adjusting to hear more clearly. Records from the final days of the hall revealed that a young man had attended every one of Hall's lectures for nearly a decade. He never spoke during question periods, never asked for a signed book, never engaged in the discussions that would erupt afterward. Yet his attendance was perfect, even on nights when the streets were flooded or the city was struck by blackout. Witnesses remembered him as wearing a dark coat and carrying a slim notebook bound in red leather, though no one could recall ever seeing him write in it. When the hall was finally closed and the doors locked, that seat remained untouched. The day the archivists returned to begin their work, they found the red notebook resting on the chair as though it had been left there moments before. Its pages were blank, save for a single entry written on the very last sheet. The handwriting was delicate, almost reluctant, as if the writer feared the weight of the words themselves. The note read simply, "I am still listening," and beneath it, a date that had not yet arrived by several months. The ink was fresh, as though written within the hour. Yet the paper itself was brittle from years of exposure. The caretaker kept it hidden in his desk drawer, unsure whether to turn it over to the others or burn it before anyone could see. Late one evening, while locking up, he passed by the hall one last time. The faint sound of a chair creaking echoed through the darkness, followed by the softest sigh, like the closing of a page somewhere in the unseen. The caretaker's keys slipped in his hand as a shadow moved across the stage toward the podium, though no footsteps accompanied its approach. The large rolled chart, discovered in a locked cabinet, was assumed to be another of Hall's intricate philosophical diagrams, a tangle of circles, lines, and symbols denoting planes of thought and states of being. It was drawn on parchment so wide it needed 2 people to unroll fully. The archivists cleared a long table and flattened it under weights. But as the paper settled, something unexpected emerged. At first, the design seemed symmetrical, like a mandala meant to represent the harmony of the cosmos. The outer rings contained markings from multiple traditions: Egyptian hieroglyphs, Greek letters, and fragments of Latin phrases. But as their eyes moved inward, they saw the symbols gradually aligning into a shape unmentioned in any catalogue of Hall's works. The center was not a circle at all, but the clear outline of a cross. It was subtle, almost hidden in the geometry, and yet once seen, it could not be unseen. The lines of the cross were formed not by ink, but by the absence of it, a deliberate gap in the symbols. As one archivist leaned closer, a beam of afternoon light struck the center, and for a moment the gap seemed filled not with emptiness, but with a faint golden shimmer. The archivist felt a strange pull, as though the cross were not simply a shape, but a doorway. His thoughts flashed to the way the Nazarene spoke of a narrow path, one that few found, though it had always been before them. The sensation was not comforting, but clarifying a sudden understanding that the diagram was not about abstract truth, but a specific intersection where time and eternity met. One of the younger researchers tried to trace the lines with a pencil, but each attempt came out skewed, as though the image resisted being copied. Exactly at the point where the vertical and horizontal lines met, the pencil would slip, leaving a jagged mark. He swore he could feel a pulse under his fingertips when they hovered above that center. They debated photographing it, but the film from 3 separate cameras came back clouded, with a pale light that obscured the middle entirely. That night, the archivist, who had first noticed the cross, awoke to find the diagram unrolled across his kitchen table. Though he had locked it away in the archive vault the evening before. The center shimmered faintly even in the dark, as if lit from within by something. Long after the last lecture had been given, and the hall left to silence, there were still reports of a voice drifting through the air soft enough to be mistaken for the hum of old ventilation, yet deliberate in cadence. It never rose above a whisper, but those who heard it swore. It seemed to speak directly to them in a language they understood without translation. The archivist first noticed it when he stayed late to catalog the marginalia from the cipher, his pen hovering over the page as a single phrase brushed past his ear so close it stirred the hair on his neck. He froze, listening, the words too faint to repeat perfectly, yet heavy enough to leave his chest tight. The sound came from the podium, though no one stood there. The air held that charged stillness before a storm, and the faint scent of burned cedar lingered in the room. He scanned for open windows but found none. The whisper returned this time, carrying what felt less like speech and more like intent, a meaning pressed directly into the folds of his mind. He found himself recalling stories of witnesses who claimed that after the death of certain teachers, their voice would still be heard, not as an echo, but as a continuation, as if the act of speaking had never been tied to breath in the first place. This whisper was like that untethered by time, refusing to fade with the speaker's absence. The archivist began leaving a recorder on the desk overnight, hoping to capture the sound. In the morning, he would play back hours of static, punctuated by moments where the air seemed to thicken and a low tone wove through the noise. Once, in the middle of the static, there was a single syllable, sharp, clear, and spoken in a voice that did not belong to anyone in the archive. When amplified, it revealed an undercurrent almost like a second voice, speaking in unison just below the human range. One night as he locked up, he heard it again, but this time from the far side of the darkened hall. The whisper was not hurried yet. It carried the urgency of something that would not be repeated. He turned toward the sound and saw the faintest ripple in the air near the podium, as though the space itself had drawn breath. The floorboards beneath the stage had always felt uneven, a slight rise near the podium that most assumed was due to age. But when a section of the boards gave way under an archivist's weight, it revealed a hollow space below. A small wooden chest sat inside, wrapped in layers of linen so old it crumbled at the touch. The chest was bound with a band of tarnished silver, engraved with symbols so fine they seemed almost alive in the dim light. At the center of the band was a seal pressed into hardened resin, depicting a circle intersected by a vertical line and flanked by 2 shapes resembling open eyes. The moment the archivist's thumb brushed the seal, it cracked with a sound far too loud for its size, echoing up into the empty hall. The chest seemed to exhale a faint stream of cool air, carrying the scent of rain on stone. Inside was a single scroll, wrapped around a rod of dark wood, polished smooth by hands long gone. The parchment was thicker than paper, yet softer than leather. The ink a deep black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The text began with symbols, before shifting into a script resembling Aramaic. Each line was separated by a small mark shaped like a teardrop inverted, so the point aimed upward. As the archivist read, He realized the scroll described a moment when light would enter the deepest shadow without dispersing it, instead drawing the shadow into itself until there was no division. The language echoed the way the Nazarene once spoke about the eye being the lamp of the body, and how, if that light was pure, even the darkness within would shine. Near the end of the scroll, the text broke into shorter phrases, each more fragmented than the last, as though the writer had been interrupted. The final mark trailed off mid-stroke, leaving the sentence open. The archivist touched the place where the ink ended and felt a faint warmth pulse through his fingertip. From somewhere below the stage came the sound of something shifting, as though another compartment had unlocked on its own. He crouched low, pressing his ear to the floorboards, listening as the faint rhythmic tapping began. Slow, deliberate, and steady, like someone knocking from the other side of a wall that should not exist. The floorboards beneath the stage had always felt uneven, a slight rise near the podium that most assumed was due to age. But when a section of the boards gave way under an archivist's weight, it revealed a hollow space below. A small wooden chest sat inside, wrapped in layers of linen so old it crumbled at the touch. The chest was bound with a band of tarnished silver, engraved with symbols so fine they seemed almost alive in the dim light. At the center of the band was a seal pressed into hardened resin, depicting a circle intersected by a vertical line and flanked by two shapes resembling open eyes. The moment the archivist's thumb brushed the seal, it cracked with a sound far too loud for its size, echoing up into the empty hall. The chest seemed to exhale a faint stream of cool air, carrying the scent of rain on stone. Inside was a single scroll, wrapped around a rod of dark wood, polished smooth by hands long gone. The parchment was thicker than paper, yet softer than leather. The ink a deep black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The text began with symbols, before shifting into a script resembling Aramaic. Each line was separated by a small mark shaped like a teardrop inverted, so the point aimed upward. As the archivist read, he realized the scroll described a moment when light would enter the deepest shadow without dispersing it, instead drawing the shadow into itself until there was no division. The language echoed the way the Nazarene once spoke about the eye being the lamp of the body, and how, if that light was pure, even the darkness within would shine. Near the end of the scroll, the text broke into shorter phrases, each more fragmented than the last, as though the writer had been interrupted. The final mark trailed off mid-stroke, leaving the sentence open. The archivist touched the place where the ink ended and felt a faint warmth pulse through his fingertip. From somewhere below the stage came the sound of something shifting, as though another compartment had unlocked on its own. He crouched low, pressing his ear to the floorboards, listening as the faint rhythmic tapping began. Slow, deliberate, and steady, like someone knocking from the other side of a wall that should not exist. The hall was darker than usual that night, though every light had been switched on. The archivist stood at the podium, staring at the open notebook, whose pages had been empty only hours before. Now, a single line sat in the middle of the right page, written in an elegant hand that did not match any known sample in the archive. The ink was still damp, glistening under the overhead lamp, as if the writer had just stepped away. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that made the air feel heavier than stone. They spoke not of ending, but of a threshold of a breath held between one world and the next. The phrasing hinted that this was not the first time the message had been delivered, and would not be the last. It was a continuation of something begun long before the hall was built, before the city was founded, before the current century had even been imagined. The archivist read the line aloud, and the room responded. The faint hum that had been present in earlier nights returned, but deeper, more resonant. It seemed to come from the walls, the floor, even the air itself, as though the structure was absorbing the sound and sending it elsewhere. A faint vibration moved up through the podium into his hands, steady like the pulse of a living thing. From the far corner, a chair creaked, followed by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the floor. The archivist turned, but saw no one. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the stage, and a sudden stillness fell. A faint draft brushed across the back of his neck, carrying the scent of rain and stone, just as it had when the seal beneath the stage broke. The notebook before him flipped shut with a sharp snap, though no wind had touched it. The hum ceased instantly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to erase even the sound of his own breathing. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, from somewhere deep within the shadows of the hall, came a single spoken word, clear and calm, in a voice he did not recognize. The word hung in the air without echo, lingering, as if it refused to leave. And then the silence closed around it, holding whatever it meant just out of reach.